Cool. So you have yeah, this is not live, and I'm so glad because I'm always flunking when I'm starting off, just trying to get into the flow. But
Sure.
You are Adam Mastroianni. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce.
Yeah, I pronounce it Mastroianni.
Mastroianni.
Yep, Mastroianni.
You know, I'm actually a little bit reminded of that actress Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just when I see the last name, that's what comes to mind. And I had a friend in high school named Robert Mariano, so they both sort of map onto that. Yeah, she's the actress in like Robin Hood and The Abyss, and
Oh, okay. Because there's another actor named Marcello Mastroianni, who I think I'm a distant relative of. I have a picture of my grandfather like meeting him kind of by accident, but yeah, there's a lot of similar names out there.
Okay. You said Marcello. I thought for a second you said he was a football player. Cool. So are you are involved in academia in some capacity, I believe?
Yeah. So my day job right now is I teach negotiation at Columbia Business School. My technical title is I'm a postdoctoral research scholar there. And so I teach and do research. And in all of the moments that I'm not doing that, I'm writing this blog.
Cool. Okay. Negotiation strategy. So there's a business focus there. I believe at your website you said that you kind of track the evolution of ideas and sort of the zeitgeist. Or
Yeah. So it's sort of funny. There's a lot of psychologists who now live in business schools, but do mainly social psychology. So it's sort of a fluke of history that I have ended up teaching negotiation to MBA students, because really my research, I mean, I'm trained as a psychologist, and my research isn't really focused on business exactly. But yeah, so part of the things I research are conversations and people's misperceptions in them, and then separately from that, people's perceptions of change over time. So I published a paper recently about how people think that public opinion has changed on a bunch of different topics and how they're wrong about that.
Yeah.
And I have some separate work on how people think that people have changed, and specifically that people think that people are less good than they used to be, less kind and honest and nice, and how we really don't find any data for that, and how we, I think, have a good explanation of why people think that, even though it's true. And then sort of feeding into that is this stuff that I published on the blog about how popular culture has changed over time.
Cool. Yeah, I love how sort of comprehensive it is. You know, there's a lot of specialization, and you have a good kind of grasp of just kind of high level zeitgeist stuff going on. And I dig that. Have you heard of the term aerosology? I believe it's
No.
Study of disagreement.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a philosopher named John Nurst I interviewed some time back. He's in Sweden, and yeah, he's written about that. I can't recall any specific points about it, but that seems to sort of be in your wheelhouse, or at least adjacent.
Yeah.
Psychology in business schools. It sort of reminds me of the phenomenon of nudging. There's a book called Nudging, and yeah, the way that psychology has sort of intersected with, in this case, more economics than business, but there's fairly big overlap.
Yeah. It's funny. I think the boundaries between psychology and economics are in that area like particularly porous. So kind of like the great living hero of psychologists, or probably the most famous one right now, is this guy Danny Kahneman. I mean, he's pretty old, but he won the Nobel Prize in economics. But I mean, he's a psychologist, and like we would consider everything that he did psychology. But he very cleverly didn't call what he was doing like economic psychology. And I don't think he came up with the term behavioral economics, but whoever did, or like however that stuck, I think that was really good for that field from like a selling it standpoint, because economics, I think, has much better cachet than psychology does. And so people are much more willing to listen to someone who describes himself as a behavioral economist than someone who describes themselves as an economic psychologist, which is why I think no one uses that term. And you'll find people calling themselves things like behavioral scientist. And all of these people I see as mainly working in a psychological tradition. There are some people who come from an economic side and like adopt some of the principles of psychology. But I mean, if we think of it in terms of like what is the subject matter that we're working with, I think it is primarily psychological, because it is about how people are making decisions and what they're doing with their minds. Whether we model this formally in equations or whether we're nudging people, I think it really comes down to like this is about people's behavior, and what we call it. I think comes down to more like what sold better.
Yeah, I mean there are massive implications for study of psychological conditions on marketing, I would think, and certainly if we're getting to economics, microeconomics, the connection of macroeconomics is much fuzzier, of course, because where we deal with huge aggregates of people and just how all of their individual and often interaction-based psychological condition affects, the net GDP. Well, that's much murkier. So yeah, psychology has done much for microeconomics, and even something like the marshmallow test have implications for economic notions of well, I guess this intersects with business as well. Time preference and capacity savings and investment and all of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's hard to like do any work on any topic that has something to do with humans doing stuff that doesn't come down to some element of psychology. And I think it's sort of an accident of history that psychology became so associated with specifically clinical psychology, and that like the first psychologist that tends to come to people's minds is Freud, who like doesn't have that much to do with what modern psychologists do every day. And so there's this like big confusion that we always have to fight against, or I do anyway, when I tell people I'm a psychologist, and the first thing they think is I'm a psychiatrist, which I'm not. And second, that like, okay, even if I don't have a medical degree and I can't dispense any pills to them, I'm still a person who can like treat depression and anxiety and schizophrenia. And I have to explain that like there are people with that exact same title who can do that. I can't do anything like that. In fact, it would be illegal for me to try. And so I hope that at some point in the future we like figure out what to call all of these things, because I think it leaves people very confused. And ultimately, I think has big implications for like where grant money goes and what people go to grad school for, and they find themselves studying a thing that they didn't really understand because it was all lumped under the same name.
Yeah, I think intersecting, or rather interjecting psychology into business might have some influence on female readership, female audience, and because the history of business and that whole general space is thought to be, an area full of kind of stuffy, somewhat boring men, and I wonder if psychology. I actually don't see much evidence for it myself, but the idea that behavioral econ will somehow pull more female readership or reach a broader audience. It still seems to be mostly men studying that kind of thing. But I think it's from a marketing angle, psychology mixed with econ and business would seem to be maybe a winning recipe for getting more female readership. But I haven't seen too much evidence of that myself. Do you have any input of that type? Demographics and how this
I'm not really sure. It's I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, although I think that more women than men earn at least undergraduate degrees in psychology. I'm not sure if that's true at the graduate level, and I'm certainly not sure if that's true when you look at people getting PhDs in business schools in things that are broadly psychological, like management, organizational behavior, and marketing. There, I'm not sure what the demographics are. yeah, so I wish I had it at the top of my head, but I'm not sure.
If you were trying to pursue behavioral econ, would you do that through economics or through psychology?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it would really come down to like what exactly is the kind of work that you want to do. Because I might say that the best places to go would be business schools where the two meet each other. So if you wanted to work with some of the best behavioral economists, you would find a lot of them like at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. Like Richard Thaler is there, who also recently won a Nobel Prize for work that people would broadly consider behavioral economics. So I think you could come at it from an economics department. You could come at it from a psychology department. If you didn't feel like you really wanted to be trained specifically in either of those disciplines, you might end up going to a business school where they might train you in a more interdisciplinary way, or at least you would be interacting with people from both of those camps in a way that you really wouldn't if you were being trained in a psychology department or an economics department.
Okay, interesting. So it's sort of none of the above. It's business school where they.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's a pretty recent phenomenon. I mean, just like behavioral economics is a fairly recent phenomenon. But 30 years ago, I don't think this would have been the case. There's really been a move of this kind of work emerging in some of like the most highly ranked business schools. Anyway, but if what you wanted to do was like really get into like economic modeling, or what you wanted to do was get really into thinking about like cognitive mechanisms, even if what you ultimately wanted to do was something that looked like behavioral economics, you'd probably be better served by going to an economics department in the first place, or going to in the former case and going to a psychology department in the latter case, and really getting steeped in those like disciplinary traditions. Because it really does change the way that you think. Like you come out seeing the world in a certain way that I think you don't when you get trained in a more interdisciplinary way. Or maybe you get better at seeing the world in both ways, but I think there's something to be said for seeing the world very thoroughly in one specific way.
Okay. Yeah, pivoting from there, I believe you had tweeted something recently about the deleterious effects of reading the news too much, or maybe yeah. As far as getting a good read on the world, are you better served, worse served, or is it too ambiguous to know by paying a lot of attention to the news?
I don't think there's really good evidence out there, but my gut would be you are worse served for reading the news for a few reasons. And here I'm using the word news to refer to a specific, like the newsiest news, which I think of as like the things that you would see if you check the news every day, which are headlines that say something like this famous person said this thing, or like this big bad thing has happened or may happen. And so I think if you read the news often, you'll get a sample of the world that's really biased in a few ways. One is that it's going to be the most outrageous things that are happening, like the most unlikely things, or the most newsworthy things obviously make the news because those are things that like weren't expected to happen or that people think are a big deal. And those tend to be things that are bad. So as part of one of the projects that I did recently, just as a way of illustrating this in a talk, I took the 2 weeks of the New York Times and color coded all the stories on the front page as to whether they were about people doing good things to each other, bad things to each other, or neither. And most of the front pages is just covered in people doing bad things to each other. And a lot of the stuff that like may go one way or the other really depends on your political orientation, right? So like Congress passing a certain bill may look like people doing bad things to each other if you don't like our current Congress. So I think all that amounts to getting a really biased view of the world from reading the news. And I think that leads to some biases that I think are pretty damaging. So some of the work that I've done on people thinking that people are getting less kind, honest, nice, and good over time, which again, we find no evidence for. I think a lot of that comes from constantly being exposed to stories about people doing bad things to one another. And if you're reading those stories every day, you might come to the very seemingly reasonable conclusion that the world is full of people doing bad stuff to each other, when in fact, I think it is not. That's one reason why I think if you want to be informed, spending 30 minutes every day reading headlines is probably not a good way to do it. And in fact, it might leave you less informed.
Yeah, the big, broad, mostly negative headlines tend to be things that are like focused on that which is not very actionable for most people, right? So like if you're looking at some news about Ukraine, you can't really do much with that. You can't have an effect on that. The latest spat between McConnell and Pelosi, you can't do too much about that. But if you read sort of maybe industry-specific news or hobby-specific news, that is something you can actually take into your life to somehow affect it. And that tends to be sort of less negative, less partisan, less kind of absolutist, and it's just sort of granular and pragmatic. And so,
I think that's right.
Kind of large-scale national news, international news, the kind of things that makes us upset is also that which we have the least effect on, actually turn around in some way to a positive effect, right?
Yeah, and I think it also leads to sort of a nationalization of all cognition. I think that this feeling of like, I'm not just a person who exists. I exist in my community and I have my personal relationships. That like I'm really a person who's in this country, and everything that happens at the national level is of direct personal importance to my life. Which like is of course true at some level, because you do live in a country and the things that happen to the government do affect you. But really, in terms of what you need to do on a minute to minute basis, has nothing to do with that. And in fact, the greatest impact that you can have comes at the level of your individual relationships. And so I think if you're going to think a lot about what happens at the national level, I think you should make a commitment to do that and try to work long term on doing it. And I'm glad that there are people who do that. But I think a lot of people actually get distracted from the good that they can do in their own lives by basically feeling angry and anxious about things that they can't do anything about. And so, I think reading news from your hobbies or your industry, I think I would even just consider something totally different, especially if you feel better doing it. Like if you're into Minecraft and you want to read about the next update, that just seems like cool and fine, like any other hobby. But if you're into reading about what Congress is doing and feeling really bad about it, that seems to me like a big waste of time.
Yeah, it's amazing when you think how many people involved in some kind of Minecraft forum online somewhere, in a different capacity, when they're reading national news and getting upset about it, they could represent the two poles: one conservative, one liberal, one progressive, one alt-right, one socialist, whatever. But when it comes specifically to Minecraft, their orientation flips. They're like a peer. They lose that kind of tribal aspect simply because of the news that they're paying attention to, the sort of mind space that they're pivoting to, which just switches that up, makes it more positive.
Yeah. And that is, I think, an advantage of, also more local news, but news that's of more direct relevance to the things that you're going to choose to do that day. You don't know, like, you're not always playing the same role in it. Like any news story I read about national news, I know which side I'm on. And so basically this is just a battlefield report as to like how many casualties we were or how many prisoners we took. Whereas when I'm reading my version of the news is reading new papers and posts that come out in my field. I don't know how I'm going to feel about these. And so I stand to learn something from reading more of them.
Yeah, I think Walter Lippmann said something to the effect of, show me someone who is, the master of their domain, master of their household, has very kind of domain-specific expertise. Clearly, he didn't say all of these words, but
sure.
Show me someone who's very impressive in that way. Then show me them, chiming in on the news of the day, international, national, and they become just common morons to some degree. Like their opinion is no different than the person down the street. It's just, there's this disconnect between their kind of granular, specific self and then their sort of politicized, worldly self in some way,
Yeah. And in part, the problem that they face is like trying to pull signal out of something that is like noise. That if you want to know, like, what do the events today mean? Most often, what they mean is nothing. I mean, sort of like looking at your stocks every day. Like, what does it mean that they went down 3% in the last hour and up 5% this hour? Like, it really doesn't mean anything. And anybody who thinks that they know what it means is probably lying to you or trying to sell you stocks or buy stocks from you.
Yeah, that's one of the dumbest things I do is look at Robinhood like 20 times a day. There's just no good reason for it. It's nothing's changed, people have said that, like, or someone said that if you were to buy a bunch of stocks and then slip into a coma for 2 years, the coma itself being bad, that notwithstanding, you'd be better off just coming out of that and then looking. Just stop looking.
Yes, exactly.
Just pretend like put
when you
back.
when you download Robinhood, they should send you a club in the mail that you can club yourself with after you buy your stocks, so you can wake up sometime later and have them pay off. I mean, this is true for everything.
They want you on there as much as possible, you know. Like,
exactly. Yes. So you might have to provide your own club.
They've got news about, you know, how well Jurassic Park is doing versus Top Gun and Maverick, you know, in the Robinhood app for no good reason, but just to keep you coming. Yeah.
And this checking behavior, I think, is true about everything. This is part of what I wrote in the post, that any behavior that you could label as checking is almost always a waste of time, because if you checked half as much, you'd probably be just as well off. And if you checked like half as much as that, you'd probably be even better, because you're spending less time checking, right? So because I only look at the headlines of the news for 30 seconds once a week, Saturday morning, my default behavior when I take out my phone is now something like, well, I look at if any of the blogs that I follow have posted something new. But I'm going to, when those come out, I'm going to see them eventually. I would see them if I checked once a day. I would see them if I checked once a week. I would see them if I checked once a month, and I would just added them to my reading list. This is why the one app that I will evangelize for, they don't pay me anything. I'm not a paid representative, but Pocket is so good. It's just you can just save articles to read on your phone. And this is the one thing that I feel like is a legitimate use of my phone when I'm just trying to entertain myself, is, I've saved all these things that I thought were, interesting to read later. Now I can actually read them. And when I'm done with each one, I archive it. And so rather than refreshing something over and over again, I actually learn something. And it's the only time I feel good about using my phone.
Yeah. There is one downside to paying very little attention to news. I mean, it looks like you have a good regimen here. You look once a week, so you're not completely in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
But the downside of paying no attention is that, you look like you're not paying any attention to worldly affairs. It makes you look kind of like a rube,
Yeah.
And so that's something to keep in mind. It's good to. I suppose you'd sort of, if you're that concerned about looking like you've just got nothing, you're not privy to things happening in the world, which every sophisticated person wants to be.
What's funny to me is
you could offset that with specific knowledge in other areas. Things somehow implicate the news of the day, but just from an angle people haven't heard. Because you're looking elsewhere. You're not just looking at the Washington Post on Twitter all the time or something.
Yeah, and what I find is when I don't feel embarrassed for not knowing something most often, and I feel vicariously embarrassed for the people who know it sometimes, when people are like, "Did you hear that this thing just happened?" And I'm like, that thing is just obviously just something created to provoke outrage. Could you believe that Trump said this thing? It's yeah, I definitely can believe it, because he's a person who says outrageous things. That's what that every story is. So I don't care that I didn't hear it. In fact, I was better off before I heard it. And all I've learned about you is you are willing to spend time reading these things and getting upset about them. So I feel like you're the one who should be embarrassed in that exchange. And the rest of the time, sometimes there are interesting things that I don't know.
That's the perfect example. That's the perfect example of what I'll call just kind of digging in your heels news. It just makes you feel worse. It gives you no new information except for the most superficial sort. It's the opposite of consciousness expanding.